On her first trip to the desert, Clara expected silence, sun, and solitude. She didn't expect him, an Apache man, quiet and commanding, who seemed to belong to the land itself. When he whispered, "I promise to be kind," something stirred in her, a curiosity, a spark, a trembling sense that her life was about to change forever. And in that moment, she realized she had stumbled into a story far larger than herself, a story of trust, courage, and the unexpected discovery of love. Before starting the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching. From in the comments. Clara had never been to the desert before. She had always imagined it as endless sand, harsh sun, and silence so complete it could swallow a person whole. Yet, as her car rattled along the cracked highway, the landscape stretching endlessly under a blush-orange sunrise, she felt an odd thrill, part nervousness, part anticipation. This trip wasn't just a getaway. It was a step outside the life she had carefully constructed, away from deadlines, emails, and the humdrum routine that had begun to feel like a cage. The small town she'd arrived at seemed to have been forgotten by time. Adobe buildings lined the dusty streets, their sun-bleached walls whispering stories of generations long past. A wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth, stirring memories of old photographs she had seen in a local museum, images of the land, the people, and the traditions that had endured through centuries. Clara had come seeking something intangible, a glimpse of authenticity, a spark that could awaken something dormant inside her. As she wandered farther from the town center, the silence of the desert seemed to grow heavier, almost alive. Birds glided overhead, calling out in sudden bursts, and the soft crunch of sand beneath her boots echoed like a heartbeat. Then, unexpectedly, she saw him. He stood near a circle of stones, alone, his presence somehow commanding yet gentle, as if the desert itself had bent around him in quiet respect. His hair was dark, tied back loosely, catching the light of the rising sun. His movements were deliberate, reverent, as he arranged small bundles of sage and clay, whispering words Clara couldn't hear but felt vibrating in the air. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a conversation with the earth, a dialogue with something vast and eternal. Clara's breath caught. She had no right to be here, intruding on this sacred moment, yet some invisible force rooted her to the spot. She could sense the depth of his concentration, the care with which he tended to every gesture. There was a serenity in him, a stillness that made the wind seem softer, the sky more expansive. Her own anxieties, her usual chatter of thoughts, faded into a quiet awe then. As if sensing her presence, his head lifted. Their eyes met, and Clara felt a jolt she couldn't explain, something electric, immediate, and unsettlingly tender. His gaze was intense but not invasive. It carried a quiet curiosity, a recognition of her as someone who had stumbled into something larger than herself. For a moment, the desert, the wind, the sun, all of it disappeared. All that existed was the unspoken acknowledgement between two strangers in a world that felt suspended. He stepped closer, yet with a respect that made her feel safe, as though approaching too quickly might shatter the fragile harmony of the moment. Then, in a voice soft enough to ride the wind but clear enough to touch her soul, he said, "I promise to be kind." The words were so unexpected that Clara blinked. Her first instinct was skepticism. Strangers don't usually whisper promises, and certainly not in such a charged, almost mystical way. Yet something about the simplicity of the words, the gentleness behind them, disarmed her. They were not a boast nor a demand. They were a quiet assurance, a lifeline offered without expectation. Her heart, which had been beating in nervous anticipation, skipped again. She didn't know this man, and yet she felt a pull toward him, a curiosity that was more than mere fascination. There was something ancient in the way he carried himself, a depth of history and experience that hinted at stories she could never have imagined. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt completely present. The world beyond this desert, beyond this small town, vanished. There was only the rising sun, the whispering wind, and the mysterious figure who had appeared out of the earth itself. And in that fleeting moment, she sensed the beginning of something extraordinary, a journey that would challenge her, transform her, and perhaps, if she dared, teach her the true meaning of connection and trust. Clara took a careful step forward, unsure of what she sought but unable to resist the pull. And in that step, the desert seemed to open its arms, the whisper of promise lingering in the air, the first flicker of a story neither of them could yet fully understand. Clara's pulse hadn't settled since his words. "I promise to be kind." She repeated them softly in her mind, almost as if saying them aloud would make them vanish. There was a strange warmth in that promise, fragile yet undeniable, as though it had been carefully planted just for her. He didn't rush. He watched her with quiet patience, the faint lines of a smile tugging at his lips. "I am Ayani," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of something old, something grounded in history she could feel but not name. She hesitated before replying, feeling suddenly shy in a way that seemed almost ridiculous for someone her age, someone who prided herself on being independent and self-reliant. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice small, almost swallowed by the wind that swept across the desert. Ayani nodded once, acknowledging her presence without comment, and returned his gaze to the earth. For a moment, it seemed like the world had paused, leaving only the two of them in the quiet space between dawn and day. Clara wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she simply watched him, curious about everything, the careful way he arranged the sage, the reverence in each gesture, the calm strength that seemed to radiate from him. Finally, he gestured toward the trail leading deeper into the desert. "Come, I will show you." It was an invitation, not a command, and Clara hesitated only briefly before following. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, not with fatigue, but with a strange sense of anticipation, as if she were walking into something she had always been meant to find. Ayani moved easily over the uneven ground, his feet barely leaving the sand, almost as if he belonged to this land in a way she could only glimpse as they walked. The desert seemed to open up around her. The wind shifted, carrying scents of sage, sun-baked clay, and something earthy and alive that made her stomach flutter. She stole glances at Ayani, noticing the way his eyes followed the horizon, how his expression was calm, attentive, almost meditative. She wanted to ask about him, about his life, his world, but the words felt intrusive. Instead, she simply walked, letting the silence become their shared language. After a time, they came upon a small mesa overlooking a valley. From this height, the desert stretched endlessly, a tapestry of reds, browns, and golds, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of distant mountains. Ayani knelt, touching the soil with both hands, and gestured for her to do the same. "Feel it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The earth remembers everything. Every step, every story. You can learn much if you listen." Clara knelt beside him, pressing her palms into the warm, grainy soil. She closed her eyes, letting the wind whip against her face, letting the desert seep into her senses. The stillness was overwhelming, and yet, in that quiet, she felt a subtle shift inside her. The world she had known noisy, cluttered, and relentless faded. Here, there was only presence, only the rhythm of life unfolding beneath her fingers. Ayani's hand brushed against hers, deliberate yet soft. Clara froze, her heart hammering. "I promise," he said again, "to be kind. To this land, to the people, to anyone who trusts me." His gaze met hers, steady, unyielding. "And to you, if you let me," Clara's breath caught. The desert, the ritual, the stranger who had whispered a promise, everything coalesced into a moment that felt sacred. fragile and impossibly intimate. She realized that she wanted to believe him. More than that, she wanted to explore whatever this connection might be, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty. For the first time since arriving in this desert town, Clara felt a sense of belonging not to the town, not to her old life, but to the present, to this moment, to the possibility of something unspoken yet undeniable. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, and Ayani's lips curved into a faint, approving smile. They sat there for hours, talking quietly about the land, the wind, the stars that would appear when night fell. He shared stories, ancient legends, lessons of respect and patience, tales of love that endured despite impossible odds. Clara listened, enraptured, feeling a gentle unfolding inside herself, as if each word, each story, had been a key unlocking something long buried. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the desert in molten gold, Clara knew two things: that she had never felt this alive before, and that she trusted Ayani. Not just his words, but the steadiness in his presence, the honesty that seemed to flow from him naturally, without effort. And in that trust, fragile yet burgeoning, she realized the truth that would guide her from that day forward. Kindness, when promised and honored, could be the first step toward love. The following morning, Clara woke to a desert that seemed reborn under the soft light of dawn. The air was crisp, carrying the subtle scent of sage and earth, and the wind whispered promises she didn't yet fully understand. Ayani was already awake, standing at the edge of their small campsite, gazing at the horizon. When he noticed her stirring, he offered a small nod, the kind of simple acknowledgement that carried both patience and warmth. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, almost like the desert itself had lent him its composure. Clara nodded, trying to steady the nervous flutter in her chest. She had spent the night thinking about his words, the way his presence had felt almost like a bridge to a world she hadn't known existed. "I promised to be kind." That promise was no longer just a whisper. It had become a tether, a thread she could grasp as she stepped into the unknown. They began to walk, moving deeper into the heart of the desert. Ayani's pace was unhurried, yet he navigated the shifting sands with ease, as if each grain had a story and he knew them all. Clara struggled at first, her boots slipping in loose soil, her body tiring more quickly than she expected. But Ayani's voice, calm and steady, guided her. "The desert teaches patience," he said. "Rushing only leads to mistakes. Walk with it, not against it." As the hours passed, the desert revealed its hidden beauty. Clusters of wildflowers clinging stubbornly to life, ancient rock formations that rose like silent sentinels, and the glimmer of a small creek cutting a silver line through the rugged landscape. Ayani spoke of each element as though it were a living teacher, telling stories of survival, resilience, and harmony. Clara listened, enraptured, absorbing not just the words but the reverence in his tone. During a pause beside a sun-baked boulder, Clara gathered the courage to ask, "Ayani, how do you know all this? How do you carry it with you?" He looked at her, eyes thoughtful, tracing patterns in the sand with a stick. "I listen," he said simply. "I watch. I respect what came before me. The land, the people, the stories, they are all part of who I am, you. You must find your own way to listen." Clara found herself considering this carefully. In her life back home, she had been always moving, always chasing deadlines and schedules. She realized she had never truly really listened to anything or anyone. Now, under the vast sky and in the company of someone who seemed woven from the desert itself, she felt the first stirrings of patience, of understanding, and of wonder. By midday, they reached a small canyon where a hidden oasis revealed itself, a pool of clear water surrounded by palms and flowering shrubs. The sunlight shimmered on the surface, creating a golden reflection that danced across the rocks. Ayani knelt beside the water, cupping some into his hands and offering it to Clara. "Drink," he said. "You will need strength." She hesitated, but the trust she had begun to place in him over these few hours won over her caution. The water was cool and crisp, reviving her more than she expected. Sitting there, she realized how much she had underestimated the desert, not just its harshness, but its quiet generosity, its capacity to teach those willing to open their hearts. As they rested, Ayani shared more stories, tales of love that endured, of forgiveness that healed generations, and of courage born from vulnerability. Clara was surprised at how naturally she spoke of her own life, the loneliness she had carried, the fear of disappointing herself and others, the desire to belong somewhere. Ayani listened without interruption, without judgment, his gaze steady, his presence unwavering. "Stories live in the heart," he said softly, as though responding to her unspoken thoughts. "If you listen carefully, the heart will always guide you." Clara looked at him, seeing not only a guide to the land but a mirror to her own possibilities. She felt a connection that went beyond words, beyond the desert, beyond even herself, a bond that promised growth, discovery, and perhaps something even deeper. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Truly seen. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the canyon, Clara realized that this journey was no longer about adventure alone. It was about learning, understanding, and letting herself trust someone who had, in a few short hours, shown her the quiet power of kindness, patience, and presence. And in that moment, she understood that love, if it grew at all, often began in the smallest of seeds, a whispered promise, a shared path, and a willingness to listen. The following days brought a new rhythm to Clara's life in the desert. She and Ayani moved like shadows across the sun-baked land, exploring canyons, learning to read the subtle signs of wind and sand, and listening to the old stories the desert whispered to those willing to hear. Yet beneath the beauty and quiet intimacy, Clara began to feel a tension she hadn't anticipated, a tension that wasn't born from the desert itself, but from the world beyond it. It began subtly in the glances of the townspeople. Children stared with wide eyes, unsure whether to approach. Adults nodded politely but carried a weight in their expressions that made Clara feel as if she were trespassing in a world she could never fully understand. Some whispered as she passed, their words floating on the dry wind, teasing at differences she hadn't even considered until now. One afternoon, as she and Ayani prepared a small fire to cook the sparse food they had brought, a man appeared at the edge of their campsite. He was a local, one of the few in the area who knew Ayani well enough to recognize him immediately. His expression was polite but guarded, his eyes flicking between Clara and Ayani as though measuring how their connection might disrupt something he had long protected. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his tone firm but not hostile. "She doesn't understand the ways of this land, of our people. This is not a place for outsiders." Clara felt her chest tighten. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but Ayani raised a hand, a silent gesture urging patience. "She is learning," Ayani said simply, "and she listens. That is all that matters." The man hesitated, but Clara noticed a subtle shift in his posture, a grudging respect perhaps for Ayani's unwavering calm. Still, the encounter planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She had come seeking adventure, beauty, and understanding, but now she wondered if her presence was unwelcome, even intrusive. Could she ever truly belong here, or was she doomed to be an observer of a world that would never fully accept her? That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and cast long, golden shadows across the desert, Clara and Ayani sat in silence. The wind carried a chill, rustling the dry leaves and reminding her of the fragility of this place she had come to love. "You worry," Ayani observed quietly. Clara sighed, her frustration spilling out. "I do," I didn't realize how different everything is, how easily I could offend or misunderstand, and how others might see me as unworthy of being here. Ayani turned to her, his eyes soft but steady. You cannot control how others perceive you. That is their burden, not yours. What matters is your heart, your intentions, and the respect you carry with you. You have both. She looked down at her hands, remembering the feel of the desert soil, the sound of Ayani's voice, the patient way he had guided her over the dunes and through the stories of his people. She knew he was right, yet fear and doubt still clawed at the edges of her mind. Over the next few days, the tension intensified. Some townspeople avoided them outright, while others offered polite smiles that did little to ease Clara's anxiety. Even Ayani, who had always seemed unshakable, occasionally furrowed his brow in quiet concern, as if sensing her unease and the subtle judgments around them. Clara began to realize that love, or even the possibility of it, was not only about connection and trust between two people. It was also about navigating the world outside that connection, where misunderstanding, prejudice, and fear of the unfamiliar could shape perception and challenge the courage required to protect what was fragile and new. One evening, as they returned to the mesa where they had first shared water and stories, Clara spoke quietly, almost as if confessing to the desert itself, I don't know if I can do this. If I can belong here, with you, if I'll ever accept it. Ayani reached out, taking her hand gently, his touch grounding her. You do not need their acceptance. You need only to honor your heart and the truth you share with me. That is enough. For the first time since the whispers and glances began, Clara felt a flicker of clarity. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance, doubts, and moments that tested her courage. But she also realized that these challenges were part of the journey, and that if she allowed fear to dictate her choices, she would never experience the depth of connection that had already begun to bloom. As the sun sank behind the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of crimson and violet, Clara squeezed Ayani's hand. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and the quiet strength of the land itself. Somewhere in that vast expanse, she understood a truth she hadn't known before. Love, if it was to be real, would demand patience, courage, and faith, not only in the person beside her but in herself. And with that understanding, she felt the first sparks of determination, ready to face the world and the divides it had drawn around them. Night had fallen over the desert, draping the landscape in a velvet darkness sprinkled with stars. Clara and Ayani sat atop a rocky outcrop, the fire they had built casting flickering shadows across their faces. The wind had softened to a whisper, carrying the scent of sage and the cool touch of the approaching night. For hours they had spoken little, letting the silence stretch between them, heavy with thoughts unspoken yet understood. Clara traced patterns in the sand with her fingers, feeling the grain slip through her hands, grounding her, yet also reminding her of how fragile this moment felt. She had spent the day listening to the distant murmurs of the town and the subtle judgments that had lingered in her mind. They were still there, though quieter, now drowned beneath the raw intimacy of the night. She wanted to speak, to confess the fears she carried inside, but the words felt like fragile birds, too delicate to release without care. Ayani's presence beside her was steady, unwavering. He had noticed her tension without her saying a word. He always seemed to notice what others could not. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice soft but insistent. You are holding something, he said. It weighs you down. Tell me. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight with the weight of her emotions. I'm afraid, she admitted finally, her voice barely audible over the wind. Afraid that I'll fail, that I'll misunderstand, offend, or make a mistake so big that I can't come back from it. And I'm afraid that being here, being with you, is somehow wrong, even if it feels right. Ayani listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the horizon but somehow also on her, grounding her with his attention. After a long pause, he reached out and touched her shoulder gently. "Fear is not weakness," he said. "It is the heart speaking the truth of its own vulnerability. To feel fear and still move forward, that is courage." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. Courage. She had thought she had some, leaving her old life behind, traveling to this desert, daring to meet someone whose world was so different from her own. Yet here, in the quiet intimacy of night, she realized that courage was not a single act. It was 1,000 small decisions to trust, to risk, to open one's heart. "I don't know if I can do it," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I've spent so long protecting myself, keeping the world at a distance, and now I want to let someone in, but it's terrifying. I don't know if I can be brave enough." Ayani turned to her fully now, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, steady and full of warmth. "You already are brave," he said gently. "Every step you have taken to be here, every question you have asked, every hesitation you have felt, these are all acts of courage. Bravery is not the absence of fear, Clara. It is what you do with it." Her chest ached with the intensity of his words. For the first time since arriving in this desert, she felt fully seen, not as an outsider, not as someone who must prove herself, but simply as she was, a person capable of longing and trust. "I want to try," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I want to trust, to learn, to see if this us can exist beyond fear." Ayani reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. The contact was simple, yet it carried more weight than words could convey. "Then we will take it one step at a time," he said. "Together. No promises from the world, only the ones we make here in this moment." Clara nodded, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest, a quiet certainty that this connection, fragile and new, was worth the risk. For the first time, she allowed herself to release a fraction of the tension she had carried, leaning into the trust that had grown between them. They sat in silence then, letting the night envelop them, listening to the desert breathe, feeling each other's presence as a tether to the world and to each other. And in that quiet, vulnerable moment, Clara discovered something profound, that love was not a sudden spark or a storm of passion. It was the willingness to show one's heart, to face fear, and to trust another with the most delicate parts of oneself. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, she realized that she had already taken the first steps toward something extraordinary. And with Ayani by her side, the unknown no longer felt frightening, it felt like possibility, waiting to be embraced. The desert had a way of hiding danger beneath its beauty. What seemed calm and eternal could turn in an instant an unexpected storm, a treacherous trail, or the unpredictable wildlife that claimed the land as its own. Clara and Ayani learned this the hard way one afternoon, as they ventured toward a canyon that promised rare blooms and an untouched spring. The morning had begun in quiet wonder. Clara marveled at the patterns etched into the rock, at the delicate flowers that clung to impossible cliffs, at the soft whisper of wind that seemed to carry secrets from one canyon wall to the next. Ayani moved effortlessly, a guardian of the land and its mysteries, pointing out subtle markers that told him where the sand was unstable, where the water ran underground, and where the rocks might shift beneath their feet. Clara followed closely, trusting him completely, her hand brushing against his more than once, not deliberately, but instinctively, seeking reassurance, seeking connection. The bond between them had grown steadily, quietly, through shared steps, whispered stories, and moments of vulnerability. She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun, a certainty that the trust she had placed in him was not misplaced. But the desert is rarely forgiving. A sudden tremor ran through the ground, subtle at first, then more pronounced. A loose boulder dislodged high above the canyon rim, tumbling toward them with a terrifying roar. Clara froze, her heart leaping into her throat until Ayani reacted. With a speed she could barely comprehend, he grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a jagged rock. The boulder smashed into the canyon floor with a deafening crash, sending dust and pebbles flying like shards of glass. Clara's hand shook as she clung to Ayani, her chest heaving. She began, but words failed her. Fear and adrenaline had stolen her voice. "You're safe," Ayani said firmly, pressing a reassuring hand to her back. "I won't let anything happen to you." For a moment, time seemed suspended. The desert lay around them, indifferent yet beautiful, the danger past but its echo lingering in the air. Clara looked up at him, her fear slowly giving way to awe, and then something else, a profound realization of the depth of her feelings. "I trust you," she whispered, the words trembling but sincere. Completely. Ayani's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, holding it firmly in both of his. "And I trust you," he replied. "With your heart, with your fears, with your life if I must. You are not alone." The intensity of the moment, the shared vulnerability, the rawness of survival and trust stripped away all remaining doubts. Clara felt the warmth in her chest bloom into something larger, something undeniable. It was love not loud or dramatic, but steady, grounding, and fierce in its quiet strength. As the dust settled and the canyon returned to its tranquil state, Ayani led her to the edge of a small cliff where the spring shimmered like liquid glass. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the faint tang of the water. Clara knelt, cupping the cool liquid in her hands, letting it trickle through her fingers, feeling life itself pulse through her. Ayani knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "This is the beginning," he said softly. "Not just of this journey, but of what we can build together." Clara's breath caught. She had feared the desert, feared the unknown, feared herself, but in this moment, all that fear seemed to dissolve into clarity. She understood that love was not a single, sudden flame, but a series of choices: trust, presence, courage, and care. And she had chosen all of them, again and again. With Ayani, they sat in silence for a long time, the spring reflecting the gold of the setting sun, the canyon walls glowing in amber light. Their hands remained entwined, their hearts beating in quiet unison. Clara realized that the desert, once intimidating and unfamiliar, had become a witness to the deepest part of her transformation, the moment where trust turned into love, and love became a force that could endure anything. For the first time, she let herself feel completely, unreservedly, without fear of judgment or consequence. Ayani's promise, whispered on that first morning, "I promise to be kind," had been fulfilled in every way, and she had discovered, in the most profound way, the power of love that is patient, gentle, and steadfast. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in crimson and violet, Clara rested her head lightly on Ayani's shoulder. Together, they watched the desert breathe in its eternal rhythm, and together, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, two hearts bound by trust, courage, and love. The days after the canyon incident were different. Clara woke each morning with a sense of quiet certainty, a calm that she hadn't known existed in her life before the desert. The fear and hesitation that had shadowed her steps were replaced by a steady courage, a willingness to embrace the unknown with open arms. And through it all, Ayani remained by her side, not as a guide or protector alone, but as an equal, a partner in both discovery and trust. They moved through the desert with newfound confidence, noticing its subtleties, the way the wind shifted in the early morning, the delicate blooms hidden beneath jagged rocks, the distant call of a hawk riding the thermals. Each day was a lesson, a reminder that life's beauty was often intertwined with its challenges, and that every hardship carried the seed of growth. Clara had begun to understand that embracing love and trust required the same patience she had learned to give the land, gentle observation, respect, and acceptance of what was. She no longer measured herself against the judgments of outsiders or feared missteps that might alienate her. Instead, she focused on the present, on the small choices that built connection and understanding, on the quiet acts of kindness that strengthened her bond with Ayani. One evening, as the sun sank low, casting a warm, golden glow across the desert, Clara and Ayani returned to the mesa where their journey had first begun. It felt fitting, as though the land itself was marking the circle of their experience. The silence was comforting, not tense, a shared understanding between two people who had weathered both the desert and their own doubts. Clara turned to Ayani, her eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "I never expected any of this," she admitted softly. "I didn't know love could feel like this, steady, patient, without pretense. I thought it had to be loud, overwhelming." "Impossible." Ayani smiled, a gentle curve of his lips that made her chest ache with affection. "Love is many things," he said. "It can be loud, yes, but it can also be quiet. It can be patient. It can grow in small gestures, in shared moments, in trust and understanding. You have discovered that here, in the desert, and in your own heart." She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. The simplicity of the touch carried more meaning than words could capture. In that moment, the judgments, the doubts, and the fears of the outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. What mattered was the connection they had nurtured, the promise he had whispered, and the love that had grown from it. Clara realized that embracing the unexpected didn't mean surrendering to uncertainty blindly. It meant acknowledging the unknown, accepting it, and choosing to move forward with courage and openness. It meant trusting another person and oneself in the face of challenges, knowing that together they could navigate whatever the future held. As night fell and the first stars appeared, Ayani guided her to a small overlook, the desert stretching endlessly below, a tapestry of shadows and silver moonlight. They sat together, shoulders touching, sharing the quiet intimacy of presence. Clara felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, not just to the desert, not just to Ayani, but to herself. She had discovered resilience, courage, and the gentle power of love that honors and uplifts rather than confines. "I never imagined I could feel this. Grounded," she murmured. "Like I belong somewhere, not just in a place, but in a moment, with someone who sees me for who I am." Ayani's eyes softened, reflecting the starlight. "You belong wherever you choose to be, Clara. You have found your place here, not because the land or the people declare it, but because your heart has chosen it. And it has chosen well." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and earth, wrapping around them like a protective embrace. Clara leaned her head lightly on Ayani's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his presence, and the certainty of their shared path. For the first time in her life, she understood that love could be both a refuge and a force of growth, gentle yet unyielding. And as they sat together under the desert sky, Clara realized that life's most extraordinary experiences often arrived quietly, disguised as whispers, journeys, and promises kept. The desert, with all its beauty, danger, and mystery, had guided her to a truth she would carry forever, that embracing the unexpected, with courage and trust, could lead to the most profound discovery of all love. The first light of dawn spilled across the desert, brushing the horizon with shades of gold and rose. Clara woke to the gentle warmth of the sun on her face and the quiet rhythm of Ayani's breathing beside her. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the desert awaken around them, the soft sigh of the wind, the distant call of a hawk, the faint rustle of desert foliage stirred by unseen creatures. It all felt familiar now, as though she had belonged here all her life, and yet every sunrise still carried the thrill of discovery. Ayani stirred beside her, his hand brushing hers in a wordless greeting. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the calm strength she had grown to trust. "Good morning," Clara replied, a small smile lifting her lips. She stretched, feeling her body ache pleasantly from the long walks and climbs, the exertion of movement through the unforgiving yet breathtaking landscape. There was a peace in the ache, a proof of effort, of living fully, of embracing the unknown. Together, they stood at the edge of the mesa, watching the desert stretch endlessly beneath the soft light. Clara's eyes traced the curves of distant mountains, the patterns of sand and stone, and the glimmer of the spring where they had discovered life and trust in each other. Every detail reminded her of the journey that had led her here. The fear, the vulnerability, the whispered promise that had sparked everything, and the quiet courage that had allowed love to take root. Clara turned to Ayani, taking his hands in hers. "I never imagined I'd find this," she said softly, her voice carrying both awe and certainty. "I didn't know love could grow so quietly, so steadily, and still be so powerful. I didn't know it could change everything about the way I see myself and the world." Ayani's gaze softened, reflecting both the rising sun and the depth of feeling between them. "Love is not always loud or sudden," he said. "Sometimes it is the patient choice to be present, the decision to trust, the willingness to share life's journey with someone else. We have chosen this, Clara, and it has grown stronger with each step we took together." Clara felt a swell of gratitude and joy, mingled with awe at how far she had come. She had arrived in this desert seeking adventure, perhaps some faint promise of transformation, and she had found something far greater: connection, understanding, and a love that felt both grounding and limitless. The town below slowly came to life, its adobe walls glowing in the morning light. Clara thought briefly of the townspeople, of the skepticism and judgment that had once weighed on her, and realized she no longer carried that fear. She had learned that belonging was not granted by others, it was chosen, nurtured and honored through one's own heart and actions. She belonged here, in this place, in this life, with Ayani, and that knowledge filled her with quiet triumph. Together, they began their descent from the mesa, walking hand in hand, their steps light yet purposeful. The desert stretched before them, vast and beautiful, a canvas of endless possibilities. Every dune, every rock, every glimmer of water seemed to whisper encouragement, a gentle reminder that life and love was meant to be explored fully. With courage and curiosity. As they reached the edge of the town, Clara paused and looked back toward the mesa. She felt a sense of reverence for the journey, for the desert that had been both teacher and witness, for the trials and moments of intimacy that had shaped her into someone capable of loving and being loved fully. She realized that beginnings were often disguised as endings, that every sunset carried the seed of a sunrise, and that the most profound discoveries often arrived quietly, patiently, like whispers in the wind. Ayani squeezed her hand, and she met his gaze, seeing in it the reflection of everything they had shared: trust, growth, understanding, and the unwavering promise to be kind. Their hearts beat in quiet unison, each step forward a choice to embrace life and love fully. Together, with the desert stretching endlessly around them, they took their first steps into this new chapter, side by side, hearts intertwined, ready to face whatever came next. Clara had discovered love, yes, but she had also discovered herself, and the knowledge that life, when met with courage and openness, always holds the possibility of extraordinary beginnings. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the desert in brilliant gold, Clara smiled, feeling that rare, full certainty. This was only the beginning.